Chapter 5 of Napoleon I, An Intimate Biography, by Walter Geer. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. 5. 1796. The Campaign of Italy. 2 weeks before Napoleon's wedding he had been appointed to the command of the Army of Italy. It has generally been assumed that there was some connection between these two events, mainly due to a letter in which Josephine says, "Barras assures me that if I marry the General he will obtain for him the chief command of the Army of Italy." Barras also states that the command was in fact given by him to Napoleon as a wedding gift to Josephine; but this assertion is absolutely false. The appointment was in reality made by the great Carnot, and Barras and the 3 other directors simply gave their approval. There were 2 main reasons why this important command was given to Bonaparte. In the first place, the directors were afraid of him, and were anxious to get him away from Paris. It is true that he had saved the Convention, and so earned their gratitude, but he was now commander of the Army of the Interior, and the soldiers were devoted to him. The cannon which he had used so effectively against the sections might just as easily be turned against the directors. In the second place, the military conditions in Italy were bad, and the position of the French army was critical. It was thought that only Bonaparte could save the situation. It will be remembered that the previous year Napoleon had drawn up a plan for the campaign of Italy. At that time his plan had been contemptuously rejected by the 2 French generals in command in Italy. Kellermann had said that it was the work of a lunatic, and Scherer had remarked that the fool who proposed such an impossible scheme ought to be sent to carry it out. Carnot had seen and studied this masterly plan, and had become convinced of the strategic genius of its author. So Bonaparte owed his appointment, not to a disgraceful intrigue, but to his own commanding powers. Napoleon only spent 48 hours with his bride before leaving for the army, and during most of this time he was shut up in his room with the maps of Italy before him. The 11th of March he left Paris accompanied by his aides de camp Junot, Marmont, Berthier, Murat and Duroc. He carried with him 48,000 francs in gold, a small sum for the succor of an army which for a long time had been in want of nearly everything. He stopped the night with the father of Marmont at Châtillon-sur-Seine, where he wrote his first letter to Josephine. At every relay he wrote her again. It is doubtful if any woman ever received such fiery love letters as those of Napoleon to Josephine at this time. He adored her, while she was only moderately touched by his ardor. She must have had trouble in reading his effusions, for as she afterwards remarked to the Marquise de la Tour du Pin, "I cannot make out his letters. He writes like a cat." He turned from his route to pass 2 days with his mother at Marseilles, and hand her a letter from Josephine. His mother was still very far from being reconciled to his marriage, and it was only after a hard struggle and a family council of war that Madame Letitia was finally persuaded to write a very formal and stilted letter of congratulation to her new daughter-in-law. A week later, the 29th of March, Napoleon arrived at Nice and took command of the Army of Italy, which he found in a very precarious situation. Its detachments were stretched out along the coast from Nice to Savona, while the Allies occupied strong positions along the northern slopes of the Maritime Alps and the Apennines, and had the further advantage of inner and therefore shorter lines. Moreover, the French troops were badly equipped, worse clad, and for a long time had not been paid at all. The new commander, without money to feed, equip, or pay his soldiers, at once won their hearts by the first of those ringing proclamations which he knew so well how to write. "Soldiers, you are hungry and nearly naked. The government owes you much, but can do nothing for you. Your patience and courage do you honor, but they bring you neither profit nor glory. I am come to lead you into the most fertile plains in the world. There you will find rich provinces and great towns. There you will find glory, honor, and riches. Soldiers of Italy, can your courage fail you?" At this time, Italy, divided into 20 small rival states, existed only on the map. The King of Piedmont was Victor Amadeus III, whose daughters had married the 2 brothers of Louis XVI. Comte de Provence, afterwards Louis XVIII, and Comte d'Artois, later Charles X. This fact had led him to enter the coalition against France. The House of Austria reigned over Lombardy, and a prince of that family governed Tuscany. The only heir of the Duke of Modena had married the Archduke Ferdinand. A sister of the unfortunate Marie Antoinette occupied the throne of Naples as consort of the weak Ferdinand IV. The venerable Pius VI, who wore the tiara, was the enemy of France on account of the destruction of the Catholic Church in the new Republic. Thus practically the whole peninsula was allied against France. Only the two republics of Venice and Genoa were nominally neutral. The strength of the French army at the time that Napoleon arrived at headquarters may safely be estimated at about 37,000 men, but it was composed of excellent troops, now long inured to the fatigues of mountain warfare. His chief of staff was Berthier, then 43 years old, who served in this capacity in all his campaigns except the last. He was a man of small intellect, but a most useful officer in his position, brave, exact, and reliable. On the staff were also Marmont, Murat, and Junot. In command of the divisions were generals already celebrated, such as Masséna, Augereau, and Serrurier, while serving in subordinate positions were Lannes, Bessières, Suchet, and Victor. All of these officers were destined to attain distinction under the Empire. Bonaparte's appointment to the chief command had not been favorably received by several of these generals, who, like Masséna and Augereau, were much older, and had seen longer service than he. But the young general, full of confidence in himself, assumed from the first that air of authority and determination which was so natural to him, and the murmurs of discontent were soon hushed in the face of the dazzling splendor of his victories. The Piedmontese army of about 20,000 men was commanded by General Colli, an officer of high reputation. The Austrian forces, amounting to some 40,000 men, were under the command of Beaulieu, an experienced general, but old and inactive. From Nice to Genoa the lofty mountainous ranges of the Maritime Alps and the Apennines divided the two armies. To the west and south of these ranges were the French; on the opposite side the Austrians and Sardinians. There are only 4 or 5 passes through the mountains, one of which is at Savona, where Napoleon began to concentrate his forces. At the same time a column was pushed along the coast line near to Genoa, with the idea of bringing pressure to bear upon that city for the payment of an indemnity on account of its acquiescence in the seizure of a French vessel by the British within its neutral port. In accordance with his original plan, Napoleon resolved to cross the Alps at their lowest point, that is to say, at their junction with the Apennines above Savona. By this road he would avoid the fortifications which defended the other routes, and enter Piedmont at the point of junction of the two allied armies, and could thus drive a wedge between them, and then attack either one or the other as he pleased. It is interesting to note that the plan of this, Napoleon's first campaign, was very similar to his last, the campaign of Waterloo. In the first he was opposed by the Sardinians and Austrians; in the last by the English and Prussians. In each case the armies opposed to him had divergent lines of communication. In each case he used his own army as a wedge to separate the two allies, and then, after defeating one army, he detached a containing force to hold it in check, while he massed the rest of his forces against the other army. He thus repeated in 1815 the manoeuvre that 19 years before had been so successful at the beginning of his brilliant military career. In this case he was more fortunate than in the Waterloo campaign, for by sending the small column along the Corniche road towards Genoa, he led Beaulieu to think that he was attempting to turn his left. Beaulieu, therefore, marched to the protection of Genoa with the bulk of his forces, at the same time giving his lieutenant, Argenteau, orders to cross the mountains from Montenotte to Savona, that is to say, by the same road which Napoleon had chosen to enter Piedmont. If this movement had been successful, it would have cut the French line in two, and that part of the army between Savona and Genoa would have been in danger of capture. But Argenteau encountered an obstacle which stopped his advance. It was a simple redoubt, defended by 1,200 men under Colonel Rampont, who for 24 hours held off 12,000 Austrians, and gave Napoleon time to come up with his army. Leading his troops out of Savona at midnight, on the 11th of April, Napoleon climbed 12 miles in the shadows of the Ligurian Alps, and as the day broke the Austrians found the French before them in overwhelming force. The weak Austrian centre occupied a ridge or plateau above the village of Montenotte, through which ran the road leading to Alessandria and Milan. When the mountain mists rolled up, Argenteau found himself confronted by the divisions of Augereau and La Harpe, while behind him was the division of Masséna. Nearly surrounded by superior forces, he was forced to beat a precipitate retreat upon Dago, leaving 2,000 prisoners in the hands of the French. The next day Napoleon turned upon the hitherto unbroken Piedmontese, and drove them back on Ceva, after having cut off one of their divisions, which was forced to surrender 24 hours later. Then, leaving only the division of Augereau to contain the Piedmontese, Napoleon concentrated the rest of his forces against the Austrians, and on the 14th drove them from Dago, capturing 8,000 prisoners. Thus, after 3 days' fighting, Napoleon had succeeded in separating the two allied armies. The Piedmontese were in full retreat on Ceva and Mondovì, the Austrians on Acquis, while the French army, in a central position, was master of both roads and able to turn against either enemy at will. Napoleon now stood like a wedge between the allies, and stronger than either alone. The configuration of the ground also favored his plans. The natural desire of a beaten army is to fall back toward its base of supplies. This impelled the Austrians to retire down the valley of the Bormida in a northeasterly direction towards Milan, while the Sardinians retreated in a northwesterly direction towards Turin. Leaving the division of La Harpe to ward off any renewal of an offensive by the Austrians, Napoleon now started in pursuit of the demoralized Piedmontese, who scarcely made any attempt to defend the entrenched camp at Ceva, but fell back step by step. On the 21st of April Napoleon overtook and defeated them at Mondovì, and 4 days later was at Cherasco, only 10 leagues from Turin. Dismay reigned in the Sardinian capital. The king yielded to the supplications of his people, and offered to make peace. By the armistice signed on the 28th of April, Piedmont withdrew from the coalition, gave up 3 of her strongest fortresses, ceded Nice and Savoy to France, and disbanded her army. Thus, in less than 3 weeks, Napoleon had won 6 victories, killed or captured more than 12,000 men, taken more than 40 cannon, detached the Sardinians from their alliance and forced them to make a separate peace, and had acquired, as a base for future operations against the Austrians, the fortresses of Coni, Tortona, and Alessandria, with artillery, magazines, and stores. Napoleon, with the purpose of deceiving the Austrians as to his future plans, had put a clause in the armistice providing that the town of Valenza on the Po was to be surrendered to him. Beaulieu accordingly expected the French to attempt the passage of the river at that point. He therefore strongly fortified the approaches to the Po at Valenza, and also prepared a second line of defence at Pavia behind the Ticino. But Napoleon, after making a feint at Valenza, marched his army rapidly down the right bank of the river to Placentia, a place about 24 miles below the junction of Ticino with the Po. Here he crossed without serious opposition, and thus turned both of the positions so carefully fortified by the Austrians. Beaulieu did not feel strong enough to keep the field against the French, so placing a small garrison in the citadel of Milan, he retreated rapidly on Mantua, leaving a strong rear guard to defend the passage of the Adda at Lodi. Here, on the 10th of May, the French overtook the Austrians, and carried the bridge by storm after a short but spirited contest. The importance of this battle has been greatly overestimated on account of its spectacular features, but it produced a complete demoralization among the Austrian troops by giving them an idea of their own inferiority. The French lost only 200 men, and they took 2,000 prisoners. All of Lombardy was now free from the Austrians, who retired behind the Mincio, within the lines of the celebrated Quadrilateral. Napoleon celebrated this victory by another of his flaming proclamations. "Soldiers! You have descended like a torrent from the summit of the Apennines. You have overthrown and dispersed everything that opposed your progress. Piedmont, delivered from Austrian tyranny, has returned to her natural sentiments of peace and friendship for France. Milan is yours, and the Republican flag waves throughout all Lombardy. The Dukes of Parma and Modena owe their political existence to your generosity. The army which menaced you with so much pride no longer finds a barrier to protect itself against your arms. The Po, the Ticino, and the Adda have not checked your progress for a single day. These boasted bulwarks of Italy have been crossed as rapidly as the Apennines." Immediately after this a deputation came to Napoleon at his headquarters to offer him the submission of Milan. He sent Masséna to take possession of the city, which he himself entered on the 15th of May, under a triumphal arch, amid the enthusiastic cries of the populace, who hailed him as a son of Italy, and the defender of her independence. But Napoleon did not remain long at Milan. After investing the citadel in which Beaulieu had left a garrison of 2,000 Austrians, he proceeded with his main army to the Mincio. The Austrian position was one of great strength. The river Mincio, which carries off the surplus waters of Lake Garda, joins the Po after a course of some 80 miles. This river forms the chief inner barrier against all invaders of Italy. From the earliest times down to those of the two Napoleons, the banks of the Mincio have witnessed many of the contests which have decided the fortunes of the peninsula. On its lowest course, where the river widens out into a semicircular lagoon flanked by marshes, is the historic town of Mantua. This city, with Legnago, Verona, and Peschiera, forms the most famous strategical position of modern history, the celebrated Quadrilateral, commanding the north side of the valley of the Po, together with the passes of the Adige. The plan of Napoleon was to attack the Austrian centre at Borgato, but, in order to deceive the enemy, he made a demonstration against Peschiera. Then, on the 29th of May, he attacked Borgato with his cavalry under Murat, supported by infantry and artillery, and carried the bridge. By this movement he broke the centre of the Austrian army, part of which retired in the Tyrol, while the remainder took refuge in Mantua, which was now invested. The peculiarities of the ground favored the siege of the fortress. The semicircular lagoon which guards Mantua on the north, and the marshes on the south side, render an assault very difficult; but they also limit the range of ground over which sorties can be made, thereby lightening the work of the besiegers; and during part of the blockade Napoleon left fewer than 5,000 men for this purpose. Alarmed at Napoleon's progress, Austria now determined to make a great effort for the relief of Mantua and for the recovery of Italy. The possession of Mantua was of decisive importance. If Napoleon should take and keep it, Austria would be practically banished from Italy and her prestige destroyed. She must, therefore, relieve it, or lose not only her power in the peninsula, but her rank in Europe. The Austrian army in the Tyrol was increased to 60,000 men, and put under the command of Marshal Wurmser, an old man but a brave soldier, who had distinguished himself in several campaigns. Besides the main Austrian army there were 12,000 soldiers shut up in Mantua. Napoleon had altogether 45,000 men. One division, 10,000 strong, was besieging Mantua, while the others were posted at Legnago and Verona. From Trent, the headquarters of the Austrian army, there were 3 direct routes to the Quadrilateral: one by the west side of Lake Garda, the other 2 down the Adige on the east side of the lake; one to Rivoli by the right bank of the river, and the other to Verona by the left bank. Wurmser divided his forces into 2 armies. One, 25,000 strong, commanded by Quosdanovich, took the route by the west side of Lake Garda; the other, 35,000 strong, commanded by Wurmser himself, descended the Adige in 2 columns, one on each side of the river. By this plan, Wurmser expected to envelop and capture the whole French army. Napoleon, not being strong enough to take the offensive, waited for developments. The 30th of July he learned that the Austrians were advancing on both sides of the lake. He decided to raise the siege of Mantua, and to concentrate at once all his available troops at the lower end of Lake Garda, where from his central position he could fall with almost his entire force on either of the 2 Austrian armies. On the next day he concentrated his forces, and the day following he attacked and defeated Quosdanovich, forcing him back into the mountains on the west side of the lake. He then turned back his columns and marched to meet Wurmser, who had directed one of his divisions on Lonato and one on Castiglione, while with the main part of his army he continued his march on Mantua. On the 3rd of August, at Lonato and Castiglione, Napoleon attacked and defeated the 2 Austrian divisions which had crossed the Mincio. In the meantime, Wurmser had arrived at Mantua, revictualled the garrison, and then marched out in the direction of Castiglione to find the French. On the 5th of August, Napoleon fought the second battle of Castiglione, in which Wurmser was beaten and driven across the Mincio. Napoleon followed up his victory, attacked again at Peschiera, and finally drove the Austrians into the Tyrol. Mantua was again invested. In 6 days he had fought and won 3 pitched battles, and had almost annihilated Wurmser's army. Austria now raised another army, which was again put under the command of Wurmser, with the same purpose as before. The Austrian commander, who had learned nothing from experience, again divided his forces. Leaving Davidovich with 20,000 men in the Tyrol, with the remainder of his army 26,000 strong, he prepared to descend the valley of the Brenta by another road, not previously described, which follows the river's course as far as Bassano, and then leaving the river passes through Vicenza into the valley of the Adige at Verona. Having received reinforcements, Napoleon now had about 42,000 soldiers. Leaving 8,000 troops before Mantua to continue the siege, and 3,000 at Verona to hold the fortifications there, he himself, with the main body of his army, ascended the Adige. Early in September he attacked and defeated Davidovich, drove him further into the Tyrol, and gained possession of Trent. This was an important position in that it opened to the French the valley of the Brenta, and allowed them to debouch directly upon Wurmser's rear. Until Napoleon reached this point he was not aware of Wurmser's march down the Brenta. With 30,000 soldiers he now found himself directly between Davidovich and Wurmser, the former of whom he had already defeated. He decided to march rapidly down the Brenta, in order to overtake and crush Wurmser before he should reach Mantua. Leaving a small force in the Tyrol to contain the defeated Austrians, with the divisions of Masséna and Augereau, he hurried to overtake Wurmser. Marching 50 miles in 2 days, he came up with the Austrians at Bassano. Wurmser was in a critical position, and hardly knew which way to turn. He had expected to find the French in front, and he found them in his rear. He had expected to destroy their communications, and his own were cut off. He could not escape. He had either to fight or surrender. He chose the former course, and in the battle which ensued at Bassano was decisively defeated. A part of his forces found safety in the mountainous district of Friuli, while Wurmser himself, with the remainder of his army, about 12,000 men, marched by way of Lagnago on Mantua, which he succeeded in reaching in safety. The Austrian government now determined to make a 4th effort to relieve Mantua. By the middle of October their army was increased to 50,000 men, while Wurmser, with 20,000 more, was shut up in Mantua. To oppose these forces Napoleon had hardly 40,000 men, including the 8,000 who were besieging Mantua. The new Austrian army was under the command of Alvinzi. Towards the end of October the position was as follows: Alvinzi, with 30,000 men, was on the Piave, threatening an advance on Vicenza. Davidovich, with 20,000 more, was in the Tyrol. The main French army, which numbered about 30,000, was at Verona. Napoleon now decided to reverse the operation he had carried out successfully against Wurmser, attack and defeat Alvinzi on the Piave, and then strike back through the valley of the Brenta at the flank and rear of Davidovich. But this time his plan failed. On the 12th of November the two armies met a few miles east of Verona at Caldiero, and the French were severely defeated, with a loss of 3,000 men, and forced to retreat to Verona. Napoleon's position was now highly critical, for Davidovich had descended the Adige, and was only held in check by a division occupying the strong position of Rivoli. Only a few miles separated the two Austrian armies, and it appeared as if their junction could not be prevented. When affairs were in this precarious condition, Napoleon, with his incomparable firmness of decision, now determined to hazard one of the most daring turning movements which history records. It was necessary at all cost to drive Alvinzi from the heights of Caldiero before the column from the Tyrol should overwhelm his detachment at Rivoli and debouch into the plains west of Verona. But as Caldiero could not be taken by a frontal attack, it must be turned by a flanking movement. At nightfall on the 14th of November he ordered his troops to take up arms. They crossed the town in silence and passed over to the right bank of the Adige, as if to place the river between the enemy and themselves. Verona lies on both banks of the river, but the main part of the town is on the right. Napoleon made use of the stream as a natural fortification and concentrated his forces on the west side. The army marched with dumb resignation, supposing the retreat had begun. But on leaving the west gate of Verona, instead of taking the road to Peschiera, the order was given to turn to the left and march down the river. This striking manoeuvre seized all imaginations and roused the enthusiasm of the army. The veterans of the army of Italy realized that they were about to turn a position that a few days before they had not been able to force. Alvinzi, who was advancing from Caldiero towards Verona, had this fortified city on his front. On his right were impassable mountains. On his left was the river Adige, deep and unfordable. Directly to his rear was the defile of Villanova, which he had just passed, and which was the only route by which he could retire. To his left and rear was the river Alpon, which rises near Villanova and flows south into the Adige. On the left bank of the Alpon, about 3 miles from its mouth, is the village of Arcoli, from which the battle takes its name. The battlefield was one of the strangest in the history of war. Where the little river Alpon flows down to join the Adige, near the village of Ronco, there is a big marsh lying between the two streams, across which there are only 2 causeways, and an army cannot move except by these roads. Before proceeding to the execution of his plan, Napoleon had ordered Quilmene to withdraw from the siege of Mantua with 2,000 troops, take command at Verona, and hold it to the last. Then, with about 20,000 soldiers, he left Verona, descended the Adige, and threw a bridge across the river at Ronco, opposite the defile of Villanova. The following day he crossed the river, and began the celebrated battle of Arcole. Napoleon's plan was to gain possession of Villanova, and cut off the retreat of the Austrian army, but before he could gain the defile it was necessary to carry the bridge at Arcole. The surprise which Napoleon had planned was by no means complete, for Alvinzi himself intended to cross the Adige at Zevio, so as to make a dash on Mantua, and in order to protect his flank he had sent a detachment of Croats to hold Arcole. The Croats, constantly reinforced, poured in so deadly a fire as to check the French advance. Napoleon himself seized a banner and led his men to the attack. Marmont and Muiron, with a handful of gallant men, followed, endeavoring to screen the body of their chief; but Muiron fell dead, and another officer dragged Napoleon back from certain death. The attack was continued on the 2 following days, and after vigorous fighting, on the 3rd day Napoleon succeeded with a part of his force in driving back the Austrians, who had advanced beyond Arcole. With the other part he crossed the Alpon near its mouth, and took Arcole in reverse. He then employed a skilful ruse to add to the discouragement of his foes. He posted a small body of horsemen behind a little clump of woods near the Austrian flank, with orders to sound their bugles as if for a great cavalry charge. Alarmed by the noise, and by the appearance of French troops in their rear, the demoralized whitecoats suddenly gave way, and Napoleon debouched open the open plain with all his forces, and drove them back as far as Bassano. Thus, after 3 days of most desperate fighting, he was again victorious. During the battle of Arcole, Wurmser remained quiet at Mantua. Alvinzi had not expected to arrive before the place until the 23rd of November, and had asked Wurmser not to make a sortie until then. By that date, however, the campaign was over. These brilliant results, says Rose, were due primarily to the consummate leadership of Bonaparte. His geographical instincts discerned the means of profiting by natural obstacles, and of turning them when they seemed to screen his opponents. Prompt to divine their plans, he bewildered them by the audacity of his combinations, which overbore their columns with superior force at the very time when he seemed doomed to succumb. Genius so commanding had not been displayed even by Frederick or Marlborough. Chapter 6